So we're here with Dr. Sharon Blackie, who is a renowned psychologist, author, and Celtic mythologist. And we're going to have an informal conversation for a few minutes before Dr. Blackie does her talk or presentation, Women, the Anima, Mundi, and the Celtic Otherworld. Am I saying that correctly? Is it Celtic or Celtic? What is it?
Celtic.
Celtic. Thank you.
Yeah. The football team is called Celtic, which is most of the time.
So for people who aren't already familiar with your work, can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, in a nutshell, my background originally was in psychology, at first in neuroscience, and then over the years I gradually graduated towards working with narrative and working with myth, and became particularly passionate about the old stories of Celtic mythology, particularly Irish mythology, and the way in which they portray women as guardians and protectors of the land. And it seemed to me that they had particularly important messages for a time, both when women's voices need to be heard, and also when the environment is, clearly causing us so very many challenges. So, in a nutshell, I suppose it would be it's somewhere in the interface of psychology, mythology, and ecology. So, yeah.
Did you grow up hearing stories and having storytelling kind of modeled for you?
I did, yeah. Even though I grew up in England, my father's family was all Scottish and my mother's family was largely Irish, and so I grew up on all of those old stories. And it was very strange because when I grew up, mythology was only allowed to be Greek and Roman.
Oh yeah.
And so everything that we had, it was just like fairy tales or folk tales or not proper stuff. And I think it still has a little bit of that reputation in some circles, the Celtic mythology. I don't know whether that's because it's a little bit more complex, in many ways, which I'll be talking about later on, compared to Greek and Roman mythology. But it's you very rarely see it used or discussed in depth psychology, for example. It's kind of people are unfamiliar with it, I think.
Is any bit of that because of how it got recorded? I'm thinking of the Greek and Roman myths undergoing all of that. Refinement, dramatization, intellectualization, and all the rest of it by people who wanted the gods to stay gods, And I know that the story was somewhat different in terms of how Celtic myth was written down originally.
Yeah.
Is that a factor, do you think?
It might have been a factor. I mean, it was written down in monasteries by Christian priests. Before that, it was very much in the oral tradition, so some of it was Christianized. But I think actually a lot of it is because it doesn't lend itself in quite as easy a way to that kind of pantheon concept. We don't have gods and goddesses of this or that. We don't have a god of wisdom or a goddess of war in the way that the Greek and Roman mythology are very easily definable into archetypes. Ours are a little bit more complex. So you have archetypal motifs and themes, like environmental motifs and shape-shifting and that kind of thing, but you don't really have gods and goddesses of, and so people find it more difficult to personalize them.
Yeah.
I think so. I think actually that's probably got a lot to do with it. And of course people don't know where to delve in then.
It reminds me, from what you're saying, a lot of African myths that are very complex.
Yeah.
Right.
And there's not so easily compartmentalized.
Yeah.
And diluted.
Yeah,
Right?
that's it.
Right. The characters and the deities are rich.
Yeah.
In their complexity and
Exactly.
nuanced, and yes.
Right. No, that's interesting. I didn't know that, but it certainly, I think it's increasingly relevant for the times. And so in a way that the Greek and the Roman myths don't, they are very, very much about living in balance and harmony with the land in the way that, the myths and stories of many indigenous cultures are. And it's only really, nobody is really talking about that very much, except I've been banging on about it for quite a while, and I think it really is time that they came into their own again.
Yep.
We started to look at them and kind of delve into the stories. So anyway, that's what I'll be talking about later on.
That when I read your work, I'm always so impressed by, appreciative of, struck by how relevant the old stories and the old themes are to contemporary concerns like you're talking about. And I was curious if there was ever a point in your life, maybe early on, when you made that connection at a conscious level and said, this is happening today. These stories are actually relevant to how we live.
I don't think that would have, to be honest, I don't think that really did happen until maybe about 10 years ago for me. What I was very clear about, although I don't know how I would have verbalized it in that way, is that these stories are very much about place. You know,
Yeah.
they're very much about people's attachment to place, and the myths and stories are very much about the myths and stories of place. So I knew that, but I didn't really tie that into, you know, a kind of an environmental issue or an ecological issue until probably about a decade ago, and then it was just like, oh my goodness, this stuff really does tell us a lot of things that we have forgotten. And I like the idea, you know, particularly for those of us in the West who don't think we have any kind of lineage.
Yes.
In the same way that Indigenous people do, we do, and that's really
Yes.
part of my passion, is just saying, no, it's there, we just weren't taught it in the same way.
And that's exactly, I was going to ask you about that, because this reconnection to European indigenous mind,
Yeah.
as it were, and that connection, so the whole issue of appropriation of other cultural, you know,
Yeah.
motifs and myths
Yeah.
and stories. I'm like, you don't have to do that.
Yeah.
You know,
That's
you have
it.
this rich tradition.
Exactly, and
You know,
people do
it's-
find that quite transformative,
Yes.
because we're just not taught to see those stories in that way. We're taught to see them as fairy tales and kind of vague entertainment, and then never really, I suppose, the Christianization did such a good job in these countries. We're just not taught to see them as any kind of spiritual, mythological, heaven forbid, kind of like religious, practical way of being in the world. They're just stories. That's a great pity. So that's my passion, is kind of helping people to reimagine those stories for today.
To reconnect.
Yeah.
Reconnect with roots and that, you know, indigenous traditions. And yes, you know, they're there.
Yeah, they are, and they're very rich.
What would you say to people, and I'm thinking, this happens all over the world, but I'm thinking of Americans who feel disconnected from their own cultural roots, you know? I've heard sometimes colleagues and students and other people say, well, we just sort of came here and that was it, you know? So, and as you know, we're a very young country, so, you know, compared to others, so what roots might we have that would be worth exploring? Do you know what I mean?
I do. To me, because I get that quite a lot, because a lot of people from North America seem to gravitate towards my courses
Yes.
and writing. I think for that reason. And to me, it's like, you don't need to appropriate the myths and stories of the land that you're in. If your ancestral stories, and let's just take the Irish stories for you know, as an example, if they can teach you if they can give you that sense of confidence in your lineage, if they can help you see archetypally, you know, what is possible to you in the land, then I think they kind of inform a practice back here. So one example would be the old woman. You know, we have the old woman, the Chalquist, who is the creator and shaper of the land in Ireland, and she's very much a creature of Ireland. You know, you can't take her and plonk her in the New Mexico desert, for example. But I think knowing that archetype and feeling that archetype is in your lineage can help you find the old woman in the New Mexico desert. So I think that sense of confidence that this is, this is what my people did back in the day, can help you come to your own land and forge new stories that are, you know, between you and the land, without having to appropriate or borrow anybody else's. And that, you know, that can be very powerful, I think. Yeah.
Well, I'm looking at the time. I think, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for this.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. It's a great pleasure. Thank you.